thank you so much for coming out this evening. I hope it's nice where you all are. I live in Switzerland, in Fribourg, at the University of Fribourg. Big thanks to Tom and Jan for their inspiration and hard work in supporting this research network. And given that we're at the end of the academic year and online fatigue has set in, I have attempted to be succinct. This presentation gives the general contours of my research project at the University of Fribourg. The presentation is articulated through a wide lens approach, which necessitates at times quick reviews of concepts and developments from the 5th century BCE to the end of the 1st century CE. That is the time between Herodotus and Luke the Evangelist. As a researcher in biblical studies, I am intrigued by Herodotus in several ways, but particularly by his sensitivity to the divine sphere and expressions of spirituality. As such, I think this invites a theological reading of the histories. This is work in progress, so I'm looking forward to your feedback either at the end of the presentation or by email. So who can rightfully take a seat at Herodotus' table of historiography? Who are Herodotus' rightful heirs? By what criteria would one examine a candidate? This paper explores this question in general as a part of Herodotus' reception history by addressing three main questions. What hermeneutical dilemma passed through Homer, Hesiod, and Herodotus? What is meant by Herodotus having a prophetic voice in the histories? And how do these questions lead to connecting Luke the Evangelist to Herodotus despite their differences in themes and theology? Herodotus has a great number of children in his historiographical legacy. Most of them are lost in the historical record. Those who have survived appear either contented, indifferent, or disgruntled heirs. All, however, have a share in his historiographical inheritance. Still, some of these appear estranged, either because they received his legacy in distant times and unexpected places, or because they have been separated by modern research. My research seeks to help reunite with this father of Greek historiography one of his heirs, Luke the Evangelist, who, like one of his esteemed literary fathers, described a prodigious story through the lens of a theistic worldview. But Luke at table with Herodotus and his heirs? If Luke showed up at the door of Herodotus' meeting, one might ask, who are you? What do you want here? So some background information will be helpful to consider whether his presence might be justified with Herodotus and his successors. More information will be given later in the presentation. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are traditionally attributed to Luke the physician, who accompanied the Apostle Paul in part of his missionary travels. It is the only gospel that has a sequel. Both texts are anonymous, but are addressed to a certain Theophilus, about whom we know very little. We could name these works as Ad Theophilum 1 and Ad Theophilum 2. Theophilus and the implied greater readership needed a comprehensive description of Jesus' movement starting in Jerusalem and ending in Rome. Most scholars agree that the same author wrote both works, whoever the author might be. And it is legitimate to read them together as one work in two parts, thus as Luke Acts, recognizing their literary and theological unity. That is my position. Others prefer to study them independently. In the New Testament canon, they are separated by the Gospel of John. The question of authorship and dating of these two writings continue to be debated. For this presentation, we will simplify these questions by calling the author Luke, and by following an approximate dating ranging from the last quarter of the 1st century CE to the beginning of the 2nd century. But first, let it be clear that there is no mention of Herodotus in Luke's writings. But this is not strange. Other heirs do not mention him either. Researchers have identified allusions and echoes to Herodotus in Luke's writings. My research takes these points of intertextuality into consideration, but it does not justify this comparison by simply adding up these links to justify Herodotus' influence. Rather, this comparison follows other points, especially through a theological reading of their works. Sorry, I forgot to activate the animation there. The next slides will show some of the research that have inspired me to pursue this comparison. I will not comment on them. They're there as a bibliography. So instead of placing a bibliography at the end, I mention here some key works out of many, many others that help show the links underlying this historiographical synchresis. So Herodotus, religion, and the divine. There are just too many to list here because so many contributions include a chapter or a section on these subjects. For example, one of the latest is in Chris Pelling's Herodotus and the Question Why. I'm also quite confident that there is an essay on the divine and/or religion in the new Herodotus Encyclopedia, edited by Christopher Barron, but I'm not sure. Luke as historian and theologian. Here as well, there are too many to mention. If you don't recognize these names, it is because they are mostly biblical researchers. All of these scholars recognize Luke as a historian at the crossroads of Greek and Jewish historiography. They also explore the tensions between theology and historiography. Luke's writings as a part of classical research. As an extension of the previous group, I mention here classicists who have contributed to this discussion. I also include those who studied classics and then went on to become biblical scholars. Pride of place, for me, goes to the late John Moles, whose insightful essays have had a significant influence on my project. At the University of Fribourg, we organized a conference in 2017 on Luke's writings in connection to ancient historiography. Historians and biblical scholars offered contributions in French, English, and German, which were published in 2019. John Moles was supposed to participate in our conference, but he was sadly taken from us too soon. All this extremely valuable research has allowed me to publish some exploratory articles and has enriched my research project. This research also led to the organization of a seminar in the Acts of the Apostles with Cédric Brelat, a classicist at the University of Fribourg. Students from the faculties of letters and theology participated in a professional manner. If you would like more information about this interdisciplinary experience, please consult the course outline sent yesterday and feel free to contact me. In sum, these contributions support my claim that Luke should be included at the table of Herodotus. One can imagine him seated next to his contemporaries, for example, Flavius Josephus and Plutarch. Josephus came from a priestly family, and of course, Plutarch was a priest at Delphi. Some have suggested that Luke was also from the Jewish priestly line. In any case, like them, Luke offers something unique to Herodotus' historiographical legacy, and particularly to his hermeneutical dilemma. So, what links justify this comparison? Very briefly, these are the main points of comparison on a conceptual level between Herodotus and Luke in their writings. So, first of all, historiography. Well, it's a good start. Whatever one thinks about the quality of their writings as works of historiography, I believe their perspective is that they understood the value of recording the past for the present. It is a creative process, both an art and a science. The intention of both authors was to provide accounts that were factual, informative, entertaining, and edifying. Both authors have been challenged on the first point, and I believe have mostly succeeded in defending themselves. Next is theistic interpretation of history. For them, this entailed a theological element. It entailed including the divine sphere as a part of this discourse. Both extended a certain hermeneutical dilemma that continues to the present. Next, common theme, divine rule in history. For both, the divine sphere guided and intervened in the human sphere. The divine has the final word. Next, a prophetic voice in their writings and a prophetic role in society. So I'm going to go to the next slide and then come back to this. What I mean by prophetic voices, that both stand between the divine and their audiences, transmitting their knowledge of divine acts to their generations, how the divine accomplished things that should not have happened, humanly speaking. These are works of piety and edification. Here I list some criteria for this prophetic element in historiography. I am not the first to use prophetic or prophecy in relation to historiography or with Herodotus. By prophetic, I do not mean primarily predictive prophecy, but rather the act of interpretation and explanation. My approach can be outlined in this way. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So the divine is integrated within the narrative argumentation, so the narrative rhetoric. There is a prophetic voice. Divine epistemological sources are mentioned, used. And then there are existential pragmatic aims. Prophetic historiography has the potential to shape their readers' moral and spiritual understanding of the world, thus also their identity and behavior within it. There's also a grounding in spiritual heritage or religious heritage. Consequently, it extends a religious heritage from one generation to the next, and it substantiates the recounted history. We could call it a divine plupast, which is explicitly or implicitly developed. Thus, a historiographical work can be considered prophetic to the degree that it exhibits one or more of the above elements, namely that the interaction between the divine and the human spheres emerges often enough in the narration as a singular part of the historian's representation of the past. The last point is simply that they have extraordinary lasting legacies. Despite their emphasis on the divine or the hermeneutical dilemma, they are extremely significant figures in historiography. They are worth studying and comparing. I wouldn't be here without their hard work. Herodotus' hermeneutical dilemma. What do I mean by this? Undeniably, historiography and divine agency have a complicated past, and Herodotus is largely to be blamed or thanked for their intertwining. As Homer passed on some historical knowledge within mythologically laced poetry, so Herodotus passed on mythological elements through historiographical prose. Herodotus himself was literarily and theologically a son of Homer. Of course, already at the beginning of the 5th century, some uneasiness about the divine sphere can be noticed in works of various traditions. The depiction of the gods by Homer and Hesiod left some discontented. The anthropomorphic features of divine beings who resembled and surpassed humans, even in their comportment. It is not surprising then that some of the cultural elite expressed their beliefs in something greater than mortals, but seemed to reject the resemblance of gods to human images. Pirène Delforge's recent work, Le polythéisme grec à l'épreuve d'Hérodote, describes this hermeneutical dilemma as the anthropomorphic nature of Greek polytheism, and she uses the plural form, polytheism in the plural. Herodotus is aware of this, and as can be seen in his description of Persian religion and their assumed critique of Greek religion. Because of Homer's enormous popularity, his theological legacy was especially problematic, and this lasted well into and beyond the 1st century CE. His writings were must-reads, owing to their cultural and linguistic quality, but they were not universally praised for his theology. A work by Carl Olav Sandnes, The Challenge of Homer, School, Pagan Poets, and Early Christianity, shows how Homer was theologically problematic for pagan readers and even more so for Jewish and Christian readers. Similarly, Herodotus' legacy was also affected by his recourse to and representation of the divine. One of Luke's contemporaries, Plutarch, issued the strongest critique of Herodotus' theology in On the Malice of Herodotus. This publication shows the interest and influence of Herodotus toward the end of the 1st century CE, when Luke composed his 2 volumes. Still, Herodotus' histories offered to the world something that was both generically and religiously different than that of his eminent father, Homer. This was Herodotus' own hermeneutical challenge, and it became somewhat of a dilemma for his heirs and for historiography in general. By writing history, Herodotus, like his predecessors, depicted a theistic worldview and consequently also a hermeneutical model for interpreting the world, past, present, and future. In antiquity and today, skepticism or uneasiness toward accounts of divine intervention are understandable, especially when reported actions are unverifiable. For some, divine agency and history writing are an uncomfortable fit. For others, it comes quite naturally and needs little or no justification. This is the locus where the role of faith and historians meet, and is one of the main objects of this research project. Let's see if I'm in the right spot here. Not yet, no. Herodotus as purveyor of the hermeneutical problem via divine agency and historiography. Herodotus integrated and extended this worldview via historiography. His work is highly theological. It is evidence of the manifest expressions of polytheism in various times and cultures, and it is evidence to some degree of his own perspective on the divine sphere. So how did Herodotus go about negotiating this hermeneutical dilemma? A few well-known examples show some skepticism, but also acceptance of reports of divine interventions. It seems best to hold these expressions in tension. In an important aside toward the end of his long work, Herodotus makes the claim that there are manifest proofs of divine activity in the world. That's Book 9, chapter 102. This is perhaps the greatest presupposition of his entire work regarding the divine, and thus also one of his hermeneutical principles that seeks to apprehend the work of the divine when allowable or justifiable. In sum, for Herodotus, the divine had not left themselves without witness. Arguably, this aside recaps his position, which is displayed in various ways throughout his work. However, arguments supporting Herodotus' stance on faith need to be balanced by other hermeneutical principles perceived in other narrative asides. As regards divine agency, Herodotus can hardly be described as trigger-happy. He neither sees a demon instigating every action, nor portrays the gods anthropomorphically in the melee of battles. He is also not a naive fablemonger, or at least he does not want to be taken as one. He makes this clear to his audience in various asides. For example, When qualifying a report about the Argives' peculiar behavior, he writes, "My business is to record what people say, but I am by no means bound to believe it." And that may be taken to apply to this book as a whole. This critical principle clearly signifies that he does not blindly accept stories passed on to him. Despite various postures toward the divine in the 5th century, Herodotus was not alone in offering homage to the divine. Athens and her allies in other places produced many testimonies of faith or piety, more or less explicit, ensuing the providential Hellenic victory over the Persian forces. Votive offerings, monuments, inscriptions, poetry, even theatrical productions recognized the decisive part of the divine in this improbable victory. Among those witnesses, a historiographical account was missing, one that put the pieces together, showing how human and divine agency worked together to achieve this prodigy. Herodotus sought to provide this account, which is a work of piety in its own right. Clearly, his writings are not intended to be a manual of doctrine or practiced religion, but they do offer several glimpses of them, and they do interpret and explain how the divine and the human are perceived to conjoin in a given historical context. As such, one can discern a prophetic voice with a dual function. Similar to other gestures of piety, the Histories offers honor to the divine and moral edification as a public function. Prophetically, it serves to bring together, for it is both for the divine and his intended audience. How much of Homer's theological legacy, that is his hermeneutical dilemma, how much of it is affirmed in the Histories? This is obviously a huge question and cannot be treated substantially here. In general, 3 positions in research can be discerned regarding Herodotus' representation of the divine, either as a sophistic skeptic, a pious believer, or an impartial researcher. In most expressions, these are not watertight categories. And it is probably obvious at this point which view I favor. It is the traditional pious view. However, I think it is possible to perform a theological reading of Herodotus as a part of a holistic reading that is able to integrate parts of each view. I find Guy Lachenau's approach very profitable as it includes a theological aspect along with other elements, which I'll read here. L'originalité de ma thèse consiste à n'avoir jamais séparé le géographe, l'historien, le moraliste, le penseur, l'homme religieux. Ce parti pris trouve, selon moi, sa justification dans l'ambition du poète épique qui inspire le prologue et l'œuvre entière et lance Hérodote à la recherche d'un logos universel. For modern Herodotean research, one might entertain the question whether it would have been better for Herodotus to leave out all discussion of religious beliefs and practices. This is the dilemma: to speak or not about the divine. It is a risk because it makes one vulnerable to critique. Isn't it presumptuous? What allows you to speak in such a way? How do you really know what happened and who did what? Why not be quiet about it? And in so doing, what if you misrepresent the gods? Inevitably, one opens oneself to criticism. And this is the dilemma for Herodotus and for Luke. If we can imagine a Herodotean narrative world without religion, how would the silence have affected his legacy in antiquity? And how would that change modern historians' appreciation of his work? Depending on one's historiographical preferences, the answers would probably also be ambivalent. Reactions to an imaginary omission of all things religious and divine in the Histories act as a foil for what we actually find therein. These three general perspectives may be reconciled in this formulation. 1. Herodotus constructs his historical explanation mostly via human agency, but this is not sufficient for his investigation, and thus, 2, by tradition and faith, he provides explanations from sources that illustrate divine agency. And 3, on a socio-historical level, Herodotus' audience can learn from the human divine complicity, which produced clear patterns of piety and impiety, as well as reward and retribution. These are all worth exploring for Herodotus because they are a part of human culture. They shed light on the nomoi of the nations and are morally edifying for his audience. For exploring and possibly alleviating the hermeneutical dilemma, I think two questions are helpful. How was Herodotus' hermeneutical approach received? And how does Herodotus orient his readers to receive his theological message? That is, in a prophetic manner. Herodotus' hermeneutical legacy and prophetic voice. How was Herodotus' hermeneutical legacy received by his heirs? This is also one of those huge questions that cannot be treated adequately here. Of course, on the one hand, we will never know the answer because so many of the works by Herodotus' heirs did not survive. What can we glean from the authors who did survive? My tentative answer can be summarized in a few points. First, the reception of his theological reading was mixed. Some seem to have no problem with his recourse to divine agency. So I just mentioned a few names: Xenophon, Theopompus, Timaeus of Tauromenium, Diodorus, and Livy, etc. Others are openly critical about the misuse or overuse of the divine in historiography, and this concern is raised to different degrees, for example, by Thucydides and Polybius, and much later by Plutarch and Arrian. They, however, do not offer a statement of absolute censorship on the place of the divine in historiography. Interestingly, neither do they completely remove traces of divine agency in their own statements, nor in those of their characters. So, on the one hand, there is a general acceptance of divine rule in human history, but on the other, there is opposition to the overemphasis on divine agency. But there is another point that is of utmost importance. Not all agree with Herodotus' theology. The problem was not only his ample inclusion of the divine, but his inaccurate representation of the divine. In this regard, and others, Plutarch is Herodotus' harshest critic. In John Mirancola's essay, Defending the Divine, Plutarch on the Gods of Herodotus, it is clear that Plutarch wants to set Herodotus straight on his depiction of the god's character. The importance of this parallel with Luke and Josephus is critical, as it highlights a critic within his own polytheistic tradition. In light of ancient reception, up until Plutarch, Herodotus appears to be received as a religious man, a man of faith, sometimes even as a pious one. While recognizing the flourishing intellectual milieu of the 5th century and its influence on Greek history, it did not succeed in replacing Herodotus' polytheistic hermeneutical approach, of which the Histories is evidence. So this leads to the second point, Herodotus' prophetic voice within the narrative and his prophetic role through his work for his generation. In this illustration, the prophetic model is applied to Herodotus, his theistic interpretation of history, that is, his unique prophetic voice and role in society. Two wars are pervasive in his narrative. The first was, of course, the Trojan War as a part of the Plupast material. It is the epic model that shapes his depiction on the narrative core of the Histories, the Greco-Persian Wars. But he is also living at the cusp of a third war, the Peloponnesian War. The significance of his living between two wars of the 5th century is crucial. For the first war, he joins with others in offering expressions of piety and draws lessons to be learned. For the second, he may be issuing warnings to all sides, especially Athens and her allies. This theological reading is supported by 2 points: the general purpose of the histories and Herodotus' hermeneutical presuppositions. First, Herodotus seeks to explain a historical denouement that, humanly speaking, never should have happened. The victory of the Greeks over the Persians was, in Herodotus' eyes, the result of human and divine complicity. It is the greatest story precisely because it should not have happened. Not only does the greater story contain smaller stories attesting to the miraculous, in other words, les micro-récits, the greater story, or the macro-récit, itself is also miraculous. Thus, the larger and universal story demands an explanation. And for Herodotus, his etiological inquiry requires the divine in order to interpret fully what had happened. Human agency is only partially responsible for the result of this story. Thus, to understand Herodotus' approach to the divine, it is not sufficient to view only singular occurrences of divine inclusion. Rather, his purpose and hermeneutical approach to the whole story should be grasped, since they orient his audience in the reception of the representation of the Greco-Persian Wars. By writing history this way, that is, by placing the divine within the chain of cause and effect, Herodotus set a precedent for his successors and perpetuated this hermeneutical dilemma. He collected oracles, signs, and stories of divine intervention and interpreted them with hindsight. Also, the ever-present temples and sanctuaries of gods and heroes are certainly geographical landmarks, but they also add to the sacred landscape. Their presence is felt especially in key moments of the history. He weaves together local and perhaps isolated events within a grander international narrative, with its own intrigues and consequences. By putting the pieces together, he thus writes with oracular authority, and in certain passages, almost as a kresmologos. Interpreting history from a theistic perspective gave him an inimitable prophetic voice. This is his prophetic role for his generation, and as history would have it, also for future generations. The theological and moral aspects undergird the teleological thrust of the entire narrative. The unexpected prodigy had occurred, liberation from the great oppressors. Readers knew the outcome, but they needed to know how the greater story cohered. No one wrote like this before or after. It is unique and a masterpiece of the 5th century. Herodotus honors both human and divine agency, and he had no apparent complex about it. He was aware of the fraudulent abuses of religion in various contexts, and he exposes them. Some of his successors imitated him, but they could not or did not replicate him in the same way or to the same degree. Others who chose to include less of the divine and who were critical of him did not succeed in removing his prominence in historiography. So, Luke. Is Luke estranged from Herodotus' legacy? Here we explore this final question. If he was estranged, we may ask the question, by whom or by what? So this is a bit of a teaser because too much time has gone by already. Was he estranged by time, place, culture, or religion, or estranged by scholarship, or even estranged by himself? Although Herodotus' legacy was ambivalent due to various problematic aspects of the histories, research shows that he enjoyed interest well into the 1st century CE. He attracted the attention of Luke's contemporaries from various backgrounds, such as Josephus, Plutarch, and Arrian. Herodotus' descriptions of the gods were rejected implicitly by Josephus and explicitly by Plutarch. But he remained a favorite for many, owing to his comprehensive treatment of the Greco-Persian Wars and his literary elegance. As for Luke, a cosmopolitan Greek or Hellenistic Jew, Herodotus was certainly one of the must-reads in his cultural milieu. I think there's no good reason to think that Luke was not interested in Herodotus. Luke's works offer much evidence that he had read Homer, the historians, and other major works that an educated Greek would read. Thus, it doesn't seem plausible to exclude a priori Herodotean influence on Luke or exclude Luke from Herodotus' legacy. Has Luke been estranged by scholarship? Now, I know this can be an awkward issue in certain contexts. It may not be your experience, but often classical and biblical research just do not connect. This can be due to our academic programs and the massive material that one must learn. One may also find a clear separation between historical and theological studies. Sometimes these fields are just seen to be too different. Yet, Jewish communities were scattered throughout the Mediterranean and became a part of Greco-Roman history. Likewise, Jesus' movement began and developed first in Galilee and Judea under Roman occupation and among Jews in various cities in the diaspora. But the Christian movement quickly became international, not only geographically, but also culturally. Many writings, if not all, of the New Testament assume a multicultural audience and context. In short, the story about Jesus begins as a Jewish story, but increasingly becomes also a Greco-Roman story. Luke Acts is at the crossroads of both. In this regard, Luke stands out from the other canonical evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and John, in that he wants to be read as a historian for a global audience, and he is the only one who wrote a sequel to that effect. Luke's works in particular speak to the people of the Mediterranean, both Jew and Greek. One objection is that classical historiography and biblical historiography are just too different. Of course, their central themes are very different. Political and military themes are quintessential, but they are not entirely absent in Luke Acts. In fact, Luke is purposefully subtle as regards the Roman Empire. True, Luke's writings are not primarily political or military, but he is interested in them, as it intersects with the claims of a certain kurios named Jesus and the preaching of the kingdom of God. If the story begins in Jerusalem in Luke chapter 1 and ends in Rome in Acts chapter 28, this must mean something politically. It is possible that the estrangement between Luke and the historiographical line set in very early in Christian history, perhaps built on the great Athens-Jerusalem rivalry. Some early Christian authors did not want their sacred writings to be confused with those of pagan authors. One famous example can be found in Tertullian's prescription against heretics, chapter 7. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? Estrangement may have taken place early on, despite the efforts of other Christian scholars who used classical writings to support Christian theology. For example, Origen and Clement of Alexandria. Another objection could be made on the theological level. Herodotus and his successors generally espouse forms of polytheism, and Luke a form of monotheism. What can they possibly have in common? Well, they are both theistic interpretations of history, and both display divine rule. Luke was no stranger to pagan traditions and philosophies. He knew them well and seeks to offer an alternative worldview through the discourses of his characters by creating bridges of understanding and by exposing their weak points. Now, did Luke estrange himself from Herodotus' legacy, or is there a rapprochement? Did Luke write in such a way to estrange himself from Greco-Roman historiography? What might have been Luke's perspective? To answer this question, we mainly have his text to propose an answer. We might imagine a conversation between Herodotus and Luke before entering the same room with Herodotus and his successors. So here, yeah, sorry about that. He may show the prefaces of Luke and Acts as a sort of calling card or request to enter. So I love this quote by John Moles, who had studied amply classical prefaces. He gives this striking evaluation of the preface of the first volume. I have treated Luke's preface from only one aspect, although Luke's writing is so intricate here that this one aspect intersects with many. But I hope to have said enough to establish this preface as one of the greatest of all classical historiographical prefaces, masterly in its brevity, compression, complexity, depth of implication, and creative originality, in its aesthetic, literary, intellectual, political, philosophical, and religious demands, and in its organic and multifunctional interactions with the narrative. Well, if Herodotus heard this praise of Luke's preface, I imagine that Herodotus would be so impressed that he'd ask for more. Let's begin with some points of agreement if they were talking to each other. I think these points of agreement suggest significant rapprochement. Both historians affirm the value of historiography and its methods at the service of their audiences. Both are intensely interested in other nations. They are men of culture and cosmopolitan in nature. Both are men of faith. The place of the divine in human experience is one of their presuppositions. Both provide proofs of divine intervention. Therefore, as they see it, it has a legitimate place in historiography, and they have no complex about it. Yet, this is not just an intellectual interest. There is a spiritual and moral lesson to be learned. Divine rule is always at work in human history. Both stories treat of salvation or deliverance from oppressive powers. This is a message true for all nations. There's no escaping it, so it is better to live in harmony with it. It doesn't pay to oppose or resist the divine. Both develop their theology through narrative. They are not manuals of theology. Thus, their theological accents must be gathered through their representation of divine acts and communication, through speeches and pious and impious exempla, and of course, through their own occasional asides about the divine. Culturally, both want to influence cultural spaces through their prophetic socio-literary roles as mediators between two spheres, divine and human expectations. We know the teleological frame of the histories. Likewise, Luke displays narrative movement from Jerusalem to Rome, focusing mainly on the Apostle Paul of Tarsus, a Roman citizen from Greek culture and Jewish theology. Paul, as well as Jewish and Greek collaborators, passed through a great number of Greek-speaking cities such as Damascus, Antioch, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Athens, and finally all the way to Rome. But there would be also some points of disagreement. Luke affirms theistic historiography, but he cannot affirm Herodotus' polytheistic theology. The nature of the divine is too different. In fact, he wants to replace it. Luke develops this approach to non-monotheistic expressions mainly through the speeches and actions of his characters. There are several scenes in which polytheistic religion is portrayed as outdated and theologically in error. So, similar to the interpretations of Josephus, Plutarch, and Arrian, what needed to be changed in Herodotus' representation of the divine was not theistic historiography, but the theology itself. Another point of theological disagreement is that Luke's writings display spiritual antagonism. That is, God's plan of reconciliation is resisted and opposed by spiritual forces. This element, as far as I can tell, is absent in Herodotus, in the Histories. In sum, theologically, narratively, as well as culturally, the points of agreement are substantial and merit further reflection. So, in conclusion, Luke at the table with Herodotus and his heirs. The hermeneutical dilemma extended through the historiographical legacy of Herodotus. It may have waxed and waned, but it continued to draw the attention of his heirs in various periods of his reception history. Herodotus' unique prophetic voice in the Histories and his role for his prophetic role for his generation, it remains the greatest example of a complete story undergirded by divine rule. Luke Acts, I think, comes close to challenging its primacy. Connecting Luke, the Evangelist, to Herodotus, despite their differences in themes and theology. The main themes of the works of Herodotus and Luke are very different. Yet, despite these differences, their teleology is similar, and their use of the divine plupas to support it is also remarkable. Just as Herodotus describes a divine will set in motion that moves toward the deliverance of the Greeks and their allies, so Luke represents the God of Israel as the protagonist who sets in motion a plan of reconciliation for the nations. I suggest then that we reunite this author with one of his historiographical fathers via his prophetic role and theme of divine rule. Both authors took a risk and faced the hermeneutical dilemma by faith. So, what benefits for classical and biblical historiography? I think these are some of the best prophetic voices in historiography. Narratologically, they tell a story worth telling, and they tell it well. Human and divine complicity drive the story forward, but the divine has the last word. Biblical scholars benefit greatly from historians reading our texts. I hope also that we can offer some occasional useful insights outside our traditional corpus. So thank you for your attention, and please get in touch if you'd like to consider doing theological readings of Herodotus or other historians.